Have you ever wondered how a single voyage could shatter everything humanity believed about itself? Picture this: a young gentleman aboard a creaking wooden ship, seasick and homesick, collecting beetles and studying rocks while sailing toward a revelation that would ignite the most explosive controversy in scientific history. That young man was Charles Darwin, and his journey would fundamentally rewrite our understanding of life itself. But here's what most people don't know about Darwin's story. The man who had become synonymous with evolution almost never made that legendary voyage at all. In fact, his father initially forbade him from going, calling it a useless undertaking that would ruin his prospects as a respectable clergyman. The irony is staggering. The very journey that nearly didn't happen would produce the most important scientific theory of the modern era. Today, we're diving deep into the complete life of Charles Darwin, from his rebellious childhood in Victorian England to the moment he forever changed how we see ourselves in the natural world. I'm going to walk you through the extraordinary circumstances that shaped the mind of a revolutionary, the personal struggles that nearly broke him, and the scientific breakthrough that took him decades to reveal to the world. But before we begin this journey through one of history's most fascinating lives, I want you to understand something crucial. This isn't just the story of a scientist. This is the story of a man who wrestled with faith, family expectations, and his own conscience, while sitting on knowledge that would shake the foundations of Victorian society. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the personal cost was immense. So settle in, because we're about to explore how a beetle-collecting country gentleman became the architect of modern biology, and why his story remains as controversial and compelling today as it was over 150 years ago. Charles Robert Darwin entered the world on February 12, 1809, in the market town of Shrewsbury, England. The date itself carries an almost mystical significance, because on that exact same day, thousands of miles away, in a one-room log cabin in Kentucky, another future giant of history was being born. Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin shared not just a birthday, but a destiny to fundamentally reshape human thinking about freedom, equality, and our place in the natural order. The Darwin household was anything but ordinary. Charles's father, Robert Waring Darwin, was a towering figure in every sense. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighing over 300 pounds, he dominated rooms with his physical presence and commanded respect as one of the most successful physicians in Shropshire. But it was his intellectual weight that truly set him apart. Robert Darwin was a man of science, a freethinker who questioned religious orthodoxy and embraced the radical ideas of the Enlightenment. The Darwin family wealth came from generations of successful doctors, manufacturers, and investors. They were part of England's emerging professional class, wealthy enough to live comfortably, but not so aristocratic as to be idle. This was a family that valued education, intellectual curiosity, and achievement above social pretense. Charles's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had been even more remarkable. A renowned physician, inventor, and natural philosopher, Erasmus was already speculating about the transformation of species decades before his grandson was born. He wrote poetry about evolution, designed mechanical devices, and corresponded with the leading thinkers of his age. The apple, as they say, didn't fall far from the tree, though it would take Charles years to realise just how revolutionary his inherited intellectual DNA would prove to be. But there was tragedy woven into this privileged beginning. When Charles was just 8 years old, his mother Susanna died, leaving behind 6 children and a husband overwhelmed by grief. The loss devastated the family, and Charles would later claim he could barely remember his mother's face. This early encounter with death and loss would profoundly shape his character, instilling in him both a deep sensitivity to suffering and a driving need to understand the mechanisms of life and death. With their mother gone, the Darwin children were raised largely by their older sisters, particularly Caroline, who became a surrogate mother to young Charles. The household was dominated by women who were intelligent, strong-willed, and deeply religious. They attended the local Anglican church regularly and expected the children to embrace conventional Christian faith. This religious atmosphere would create a tension in Charles's mind that would persist throughout his life as his scientific observations increasingly conflicted with biblical teachings. From his earliest years, Charles displayed the curiosity and collecting instinct that would define his career. While other boys played with toys, he gathered shells, minerals, coins, and especially beetles. His passion for collecting was so intense that his family nicknamed him Gas, short for gastronomy, because of his habit of eating unusual foods to see what they tasted like. He once bit into a piece of bark to test its flavour and kept a detailed journal of his various culinary experiments. But it was his beetle collecting that truly captured his imagination. Charles would spend hours hunting through rotting logs, under stones, and in garden compost heaps, searching for new species to add to his growing collection. He became so obsessed that he would carry specimens in his mouth when his hands were full, once spitting out a rare beetle when it began secreting acid that burned his tongue. This wasn't just a childhood hobby, it was the beginning of a lifelong passion for understanding the intricate relationships between living creatures and their environments. The local countryside around Shrewsbury became his first laboratory. He studied the habits of birds, collected fossils from nearby quarries, and learned the names of every plant and flower in the region. His sisters worried that he was becoming too solitary, too obsessed with his collections, but their father recognized something special in the boy's intense focus and methodical approach to observation. School, however, was a different matter entirely. Charles was sent to Shrewsbury School, a prestigious institution just a few hundred yards from his family home. The school emphasized classical education, Latin, Greek, and ancient literature, subjects that bored Charles to tears. He was a mediocre student at best, showing little aptitude for languages or mathematics. His teachers considered him average, even lazy, and his headmaster publicly criticized him for wasting time on useless pursuits like beetle collecting instead of focusing on proper academic subjects. The rigid, authoritarian atmosphere of Victorian education clashed with Charles's naturally curious and independent mind. He later wrote that the school was nothing but a blank in his memory, a place where his natural love of learning was nearly extinguished by rote memorization and harsh discipline. The irony is almost painful to contemplate. Here was one of history's greatest minds being dismissed as ordinary by an educational system that valued conformity over creativity. But Charles found other ways to feed his intellectual hunger. He began attending lectures at the local scientific society, where he heard discussions about geology, chemistry, and natural history. He read voraciously, devouring books about exploration and adventure. The works of Alexander von Humboldt, the great German naturalist and explorer, particularly captured his imagination. Humboldt's vivid descriptions of tropical landscapes and exotic creatures fired Charles's desire to see the world beyond the quiet countryside of Shropshire. His father, meanwhile, was growing increasingly concerned about Charles's future. The boy showed no aptitude for traditional academic subjects and seemed more interested in collecting beetles than building a respectable career. Robert Darwin was a practical man who understood that his son would need a profession that could support him in the style to which he was accustomed. Medicine seemed like the obvious choice. After all, both his father and grandfather had been successful physicians, and the family had connections throughout the medical community. In 1825, at the age of 16, Charles was sent to Edinburgh University to study medicine. Edinburgh was considered the finest medical school in Britain, perhaps in all of Europe. The city itself was a centre of intellectual ferment, home to leading thinkers in philosophy, science, and literature. For a young man with scientific interests, it should have been paradise, Instead, it became a kind of intellectual purgatory. Charles was horrified by the brutal realities of early 19th century medicine. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, patients screamed in agony, and the mortality rates were shocking. He attended exactly 2 operations before fleeing the theatre in disgust, unable to bear the sight of human suffering. The experience left him physically ill and emotionally shaken. The formal medical curriculum was hardly more appealing. Lectures were dry, theoretical, and seemed disconnected from the vibrant world of living creatures that fascinated him. Charles found himself skipping classes, spending his time instead wandering the Scottish coastline, collecting marine specimens and studying the geology of ancient rock formations. But Edinburgh wasn't entirely a waste. Away from the formal classroom, Charles encountered ideas that would prove crucial to his intellectual development. He joined student societies where young men debated the latest scientific theories, including radical ideas about the transformation of species. He met Robert Grant, a marine biologist who openly discussed the evolutionary theories of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the French naturalist who proposed that species could change over time. These conversations were Charles's first exposure to the concept of evolution, though he didn't yet grasp its full implications. The ideas seemed exotic, even dangerous, in a society where the biblical account of creation was considered unquestionable truth, but they planted seeds of doubt about the fixity of species that would eventually grow into revolutionary insights. Charles also began learning the practical skills of a naturalist. He studied taxidermy with John Edmonstone, a freed slave from South America who taught him how to preserve and mount bird specimens. Edmonstone's stories of tropical rainforests and exotic wildlife further fueled Charles's desire for adventure and exploration. The irony was profound. A former slave was teaching the techniques that would help a privileged English gentleman revolutionize scientific thinking. After 2 years in Edinburgh, it became clear that Charles would never become a doctor. He had no stomach for the suffering inherent in medical practice and no interest in the theoretical aspects of the field. His father was disappointed, but not entirely surprised. Robert Darwin was a perceptive man who could see that his son's interests lay elsewhere. The question then became, what should Charles do with his life? In Victorian England, a gentleman's son had limited respectable options. Business was considered beneath the dignity of the educated classes. The military offered adventure, but required connections and considerable expense. That left essentially one socially acceptable career for a young man of Charles's background and inclinations: the church. The suggestion that Charles become a clergyman might seem bizarre given his later role in challenging religious orthodoxy, but it made perfect sense in the context of his time and class. Country parsons were expected to be educated gentlemen who could provide moral leadership to rural communities. Many were also natural historians, using their leisure time to study local flora and fauna. The position offered a comfortable income, social respectability, and ample opportunity to pursue scientific interests as a hobby. Charles himself wasn't particularly religious, but neither was he actively atheistic. He accepted the basic tenets of Christianity without deep conviction or serious doubt. The prospect of a quiet country living, with time for beetle collecting and geological studies, actually appealed to him. It seemed like a reasonable compromise between family expectations and personal inclinations. So in 1828, Charles entered Christ's College, Cambridge, to study for a Bachelor of Arts degree that would qualify him for ordination in the Church of England. Cambridge in the 1820s was a very different place from the intellectual hothouse of Edinburgh. It was more conservative, more traditional, more focused on classical education and religious orthodoxy, but it was also more relaxed, more tolerant of gentlemanly pursuits like hunting and collecting. Charles threw himself into Cambridge life with characteristic enthusiasm, though not necessarily in the ways his professors intended. While he dutifully attended lectures on theology and classics, his real education was happening outside the formal curriculum. He joined the Beagle Society, a group of passionate entomologists who competed to find the rarest specimens in the countryside around Cambridge. His collection grew rapidly, and he even discovered several species new to the Cambridge area, achievements that earned him recognition in scientific journals. The social side of university life also captivated him. Charles joined the Glutton Club, whose members met regularly to dine on unusual animals and birds. They ate hawks, owls, and even an old brown owl that proved so tough and unpalatable that the club disbanded shortly after. These dining adventures reflected his lifelong curiosity about the natural world, though his approach was decidedly more gustatory than scientific at this stage. More importantly, for his future, Charles formed friendships that would shape the trajectory of his life. He became close to John Stevens Henslow, the professor of botany, who recognized the young man's potential, despite his lackluster academic performance. Henslow invited Charles to join him on botanical expeditions around Cambridge, teaching him to observe carefully and think systematically about the relationships between plants and their environments. These walks with Henslow were transformative. The professor didn't just point out different species, he asked probing questions about why certain plants grew in particular locations, how they reproduced, and what factors influenced their distribution. For the first time, Charles began to think like a scientist rather than merely a collector. He learned to look beyond the surface characteristics of specimens to consider the underlying principles that govern their existence. Henslow also introduced Charles to the work of Alexander von Humboldt, whose personal narrative of a journey to the equinoctial regions of the new continent had recently been translated into English. Humboldt's vivid descriptions of South American landscapes, his detailed observations of tropical ecosystems, and his romantic vision of scientific exploration as a noble pursuit captured Charles's imagination completely. He later wrote that no book had ever influenced him more profoundly. The young Darwin began dreaming of his own voyage to exotic lands. He studied Spanish in preparation for a potential trip to the Canary Islands, where Humboldt had made some of his most famous observations. He badgered Henslow with questions about tropical botany and pestered his friends to join him in planning an expedition. The idea of adventure, combined with serious scientific work, appealed to every aspect of his personality. But there was another influence at Cambridge that would prove equally significant, though in a very different way. William Paley's Natural Theology was required reading for all students preparing for ordination, and Charles found himself genuinely impressed by Paley's arguments. The book presented the classic argument from the design, using examples from nature to demonstrate God's wisdom and benevolence. Paley's famous analogy of the watchmaker became deeply embedded in Charles's thinking. Just as a watch implies a watchmaker, the intricate adaptations of living creatures implied an intelligent designer. Charles was particularly struck by Paley's discussion of the eye, with its perfect optical properties and complex coordinated parts. How could such an organ arise through any process other than deliberate creation? The argument seemed unassailable, and Charles accepted it completely. Years later, when he was developing his own very different explanation for biological complexity, he would still remember the force of Paley's reasoning and the challenge it posed to any naturalistic account of adaptation. His academic performance remained mediocre throughout his Cambridge years. He scraped through his examinations without distinction, ranking 10th among the 22 students who passed without honours in 1831. His professors considered him a pleasant enough young man, but hardly marked for greatness. One tutor later recalled that Darwin seemed more interested in shooting partridges than studying theology. Yet beneath this unremarkable academic surface, profound changes were occurring in Charles's intellectual development. His friendship with Henslow had introduced him to rigorous scientific methodology. His reading of Humboldt had awakened dreams of exploration and discovery. His beetle collecting had evolved from a boyish hobby into a serious study of natural history. All the pieces were falling into place for something extraordinary, though neither Charles nor anyone around him could have predicted what was coming. The summer of 1831 found Charles preparing for what seemed like a predetermined future. He had passed his examinations and would soon be ordained as an Anglican clergyman. His father had already begun making inquiries about suitable country parishes where his son might serve as a vicar. The plan was for Charles to spend a few more months at Cambridge, perhaps take a short trip to the Canary Islands to satisfy his wanderlust, and then settle into the comfortable routine of parish life. But fate, as it often does, had other plans entirely. On August 29th, 1831, Charles returned to his family home in Shrewsbury after a geological expedition in Wales with his Cambridge friend Adam Sedgwick. He was tired, dirty, and eager for a bath and a hot meal. Instead, he found a letter waiting that would change everything. The letter was from Professor Henslow, and its contents were so extraordinary that Charles had to read it twice to believe what he was seeing. Captain Robert Fitzroy of the Royal Navy was planning a surveying voyage around the world aboard HMS Beagle. The ship would map the coastlines of South America, establish accurate chronological measurements, and conduct various scientific observations. Fitzroy, who was only 26 years old himself, wanted a gentleman companion who could serve as the ship's naturalist and provide educated conversation during the long months at sea. Henslow had recommended Charles for the position. The voyage would last at least 2 years, possibly longer. It would involve considerable hardship and some danger. There would be no salary, and Charles would need to pay for his own meals and equipment. But it would also offer unparalleled opportunities to study geology, zoology, and botany in some of the most remote and scientifically unexplored regions on Earth. Charles was electrified. Here was the adventure he had dreamed about, the chance to follow in Humboldt's footsteps and make his own contributions to natural science. He immediately wrote back to Henslow, accepting the offer with enthusiasm and gratitude. But there was one enormous obstacle standing in his way: his father. Robert Darwin was horrified by the proposal. He saw it as a wild scheme that would ruin his son's prospects for a respectable career in the church. What bishop would want to ordain a clergyman who had spent years gallivanting around the world, collecting beetles and rocks? The voyage would delay Charles's entry into holy orders, waste valuable time that should be spent building a reputation for responsibility and moral character, and expose him to all sorts of dangerous influences and ideas. The argument between father and son was intense and painful. Robert Darwin was not a man accustomed to having his judgment questioned, and he had strong opinions about what constituted appropriate behaviour for a gentleman. Adventure and scientific exploration were all very well as hobbies, but they were no substitutes for a solid professional foundation. Charles was already 22 years old, an age when he should be establishing himself in society rather than chasing romantic fantasies. Charles found himself torn between his deepest desires and his respect for his father's wishes. He had been raised to honour parental authority, and he genuinely loved and admired his father despite their disagreements. Moreover, he was financially dependent on Robert Darwin's support. Without his father's approval, the voyage was impossible. In a moment of desperation, Charles wrote back to Henslow, declining the offer. The letter was one of the most difficult he had ever composed, but he felt he had no choice. His duty to his family had to come before his personal ambitions, no matter how painful the sacrifice might be. But the story was far from over. Charles's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood II, had been watching the family drama unfold with growing concern. Wedgwood was a successful pottery manufacturer, a man of the world who understood both business and adventure. More importantly, he was one of the few people whose opinion Robert Darwin genuinely respected. Wedgwood could see that his nephew was genuinely passionate about natural history and that this voyage represented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He also recognised that forcing Charles into an unwanted career might ultimately prove counterproductive. A reluctant clergyman was unlikely to be either happy or successful, and the family's reputation might suffer more from Charles's evident lack of enthusiasm for church life than from his temporary absence on a scientific voyage. Working carefully behind the scenes, Wedgwood arranged a private conversation with Robert Darwin. He presented the voyage not as a frivolous adventure, but as a valuable educational experience that would enhance Charles's qualifications for any future career. A young man who had travelled the world, observed different cultures and made scientific contributions would surely be more effective as a clergyman than one who had never ventured beyond the English countryside. The argument was brilliantly crafted to appeal to Robert Darwin's practical nature, while addressing his specific concerns about his son's future. Wedgwood emphasised that the voyage had official Royal Navy backing, that it was a serious scientific expedition rather than mere tourism, and that Charles would be associating with respectable naval officers rather than dubious foreign adventurers. Gradually, Robert Darwin's resistance began to weaken. He loved his son and wanted him to be happy, even if he couldn't entirely understand Charles's scientific passions. The prospect of watching Charles waste away in an unsuitable profession was genuinely painful to contemplate. Perhaps he began to think, this voyage might actually be the making of the young man. On September 1st, 1831, just 3 days after his initial refusal, Robert Darwin changed his mind and gave his consent to the voyage. Charles was overjoyed, though he tried to contain his enthusiasm out of respect for his father's feelings. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation as he assembled the equipment, books and supplies he would need for the journey ahead. But first he had to meet Captain Fitzroy and pass what amounted to an informal interview for the position. This meeting, arranged in London, would determine whether Charles actually sailed with the Beagle or remained safely at home preparing for ordination. The stakes could not have been higher, and both young men approached the encounter with considerable anxiety about the compatibility that would be essential for a successful voyage. The meeting between Charles Darwin and Captain Robert Fitzroy took place in a London hotel room on September 5th, 1831, and it nearly ended before it began. Fitzroy, an aristocratic naval officer with piercing blue eyes and an imperious manner, took one look at Charles's nose and almost rejected him on the spot. As a devoted follower of phrenology, Fitzroy believed that facial features revealed character, and he was convinced that Charles's nose indicated a lack of energy and determination. Fortunately for the future of science, Fitzroy's other impressions of the young naturalist proved more favourable. Charles was clearly a gentleman, well educated and enthusiastic about natural history. His letters of recommendation from Henslow and other Cambridge professors were impeccable. Most importantly, he seemed like someone who could provide intelligent conversation during the long months at sea without challenging the captain's absolute authority aboard ship. Fitzroy himself was a fascinating and complex character. At 26, he was younger than many of his officers, but he commanded respect through his exceptional seamanship and aristocratic bearing. He was the grandson of the Duke of Grafton, a man born to privilege who had chosen the demanding life of a naval officer. His previous command of the Beagle had been marked by both brilliant surveying work and personal tragedy when the ship's former captain had committed suicide, leaving Fitzroy to complete the mission. The young captain was deeply religious, convinced that the voyage would provide evidence for the literal truth of biblical creation. He wanted a naturalist aboard who would collect specimens and make observations that would demonstrate God's wisdom in designing the natural world. The irony of this expectation, given what Charles would eventually discover, adds a poignant dimension to their initial meeting. After several hours of conversation, both men were satisfied. Fitzroy found Charles to be a suitable gentleman companion, someone who could share his meals and provide educated discourse without threatening naval discipline. Charles was thrilled by Fitzroy's knowledge of foreign lands and his plans for the voyage. They shook hands and the deal was struck. HMS Beagle was a Cherokee-class brig sloop, 90 feet long and barely 24 feet wide. She had been built for speed and maneuverability rather than comfort, and Charles's first sight of her at Plymouth Dock was somewhat dismaying. The ship seemed impossibly small for a voyage that might last several years. His assigned quarters were tiny, a space he would share with the ship's charts and surveying instruments. There was barely room for a hammock, let alone the books, equipment, and collecting materials he planned to bring. But Charles was too excited to be deterred by cramped conditions. This was his chance to see the world, to follow in the footsteps of his hero Alexander von Humboldt, and to make genuine contributions to natural science. He threw himself into preparations with characteristic thoroughness, purchasing microscopes, geological hammers, specimen bottles, and hundreds of other items he thought might prove useful. The departure was delayed repeatedly by bad weather and last-minute preparations. Charles used the time to study Spanish, read everything he could find about South America, and familiarize himself with the ship and crew. He was particularly impressed by the Beagle's library, which contained works by the leading naturalists and explorers of the day. Fitzroy had spared no expense in equipping the voyage for serious scientific work. On December 27, 1831, HMS Beagle finally cleared Plymouth Harbour and set course for the open ocean. Charles stood at the rail, watching the English coastline recede into the distance, aware that he was embarking on the greatest adventure of his life. He had no way of knowing that he was also beginning a journey that would fundamentally transform human understanding of life itself. The first few weeks at sea were miserable. Charles suffered from severe seasickness that left him weak, nauseated, and barely able to eat. He lay in his hammock, wondering whether he had made a terrible mistake in leaving the comfortable predictability of English country life. The Beagle pitched and rolled through heavy Atlantic swells, and Charles began to understand why sailors called their ships home rather than any place on dry land. But gradually, his sea legs developed, and he began to appreciate the rhythm of shipboard life. The crew was professional and friendly, treating him with the respect due to a gentleman passenger. The officers were educated men who shared his interests in science and exploration. Fitzroy proved to be an excellent captain, demanding but fair, with an encyclopedic knowledge of navigation and seamanship. More importantly, Charles began to understand the extraordinary scientific opportunities the voyage would provide. Every day brought new observations, whether of seabirds following the ship, marine life visible in the clear blue water, or the changing patterns of wind and weather. He started a detailed journal, recording everything he saw with the methodical precision that would characterize all his future scientific work. The Beagle's first major stop was the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of West Africa. For Charles, stepping ashore at Porto Praya was like entering a new world. The tropical vegetation, the intense heat, the exotic birds and insects, the volcanic landscape, everything was different from anything he had experienced in England. He collected specimens frantically, wrote detailed descriptions, and began to understand the profound differences between tropical and temperate ecosystems. But it was a simple geological observation that provided his first major scientific insight. Charles noticed a white band of shells and coral embedded in a cliff face 30 feet above the current sea level. The implications were startling. Either the land had been raised, or the sea level had dropped significantly since those marine organisms had lived. This was direct evidence that the Earth's surface was not fixed and unchanging, as most people believed, but dynamic and constantly evolving. The observation forced Charles to think seriously about geological time for the first time. If the land could rise 30 feet, how long might such a process take? What other changes might occur over vast periods? These questions would prove crucial to his later understanding of biological evolution, though he didn't yet make that connection. From Cape Verde, the Beagle sailed south along the African coast before turning west toward Brazil. Charles spent the crossing reading Charles Lyell's newly published Principles of Geology, a book that Fitzroy had given him, with the warning that he shouldn't believe everything in it. Lyell argued that the Earth's geological features could be explained by gradual processes operating over immense periods of time, rather than sudden catastrophes like the biblical flood. The book was a revelation. Lyell's uniformitarian approach, the idea that present processes could explain past events, provided a framework for understanding the geological observations Charles was making. If mountains could be built grain by grain through gradual uplift, and canyons carved drop by drop through patient erosion, then the Earth must be far older than the few thousand years suggested by biblical chronology. On February 29th, 1832, the Beagle anchored in the harbour at Bahia, Brazil, and Charles got his first taste of a South American rainforest. The experience was overwhelming. The diversity of life was beyond anything he had imagined. Brilliant butterflies fluttered through shafts of sunlight. Exotic birds called from the canopy, and the very air seemed to vibrate with the sounds of countless unseen creatures. Charles wrote to his father that no one could imagine the splendour of a tropical forest without seeing it firsthand. He collected specimens with manic enthusiasm, discovering new species of beetles, spiders, and other invertebrates almost daily. His notebooks filled with detailed descriptions and rough sketches, the raw material for future scientific papers. But the social reality of Brazil also confronted him with uncomfortable truths. Slavery was still legal throughout the Portuguese colony, and Charles witnessed scenes of human bondage that horrified him. He saw slaves beaten in the streets, families torn apart at auction, and human beings treated as mere property. The contrast between the natural paradise of the rainforest and the human-created hell of slavery troubled him deeply. These observations created tension with Captain Fitzroy, who defended slavery as a natural and beneficial institution. Their arguments became so heated that Fitzroy at one point threatened to put Charles ashore and continue the voyage without him. The crisis passed, but it established a pattern of philosophical disagreement that would characterize their relationship throughout the voyage. For Charles, the slavery question forced him to think seriously about human nature and social institutions. If human beings could be so cruel to their own species, what did that say about divine benevolence and natural harmony? These moral questions would later influence his thinking about competition and struggle in nature, though the connections wouldn't become clear for many years. The Beagle continued south along the Brazilian coast, stopping at Rio de Janeiro before heading toward Argentina. At each port, Charles went ashore to explore and collect, gradually building up an enormous collection of specimens that he shipped back to England in carefully labelled boxes. Henslow received these shipments with growing excitement, recognising that his former student was making discoveries of genuine scientific importance. In Argentina, Charles encountered his first major fossil discoveries. Near Bahia Blanca, he found the remains of enormous, extinct mammals embedded in coastal cliffs. There were giant ground sloths larger than elephants, massive armadillo-like creatures called glyptodonts, and strange horse-like animals unlike anything in the modern world. The fossils were beautifully preserved, and Charles spent days carefully excavating them and recording their geological context. These discoveries raised profound questions about the history of life. Why had these giant mammals disappeared? When had they lived? What relationship did they bear to modern South American fauna? Charles noticed similarities between the extinct giants and living species, particularly between the fossil glyptodonts and modern armadillos. Could there be some connection between past and present forms of life? The questions multiplied as the voyage continued. In Patagonia, Charles found fossil shells of marine animals at elevations of hundreds of feet above sea level. In the Andes, he discovered petrified trees that had clearly grown at sea level, but were now embedded in mountain peaks, thousands of feet high. The evidence for massive geological change was overwhelming, but what did it all mean? Meanwhile, Fitzroy was conducting his own scientific work, making precise measurements of coastal features and ocean depths that would prove invaluable for future navigation. The captain was a skilled surveyor and astronomer, and his charts of South American waters would be used by the Royal Navy for decades. But his religious convictions remained unshaken by the geological evidence accumulating around him. As 1832 turned into 1833, the Beagle worked its way around Cape Horn and up the western coast of South America. Charles suffered through the stormy passage around the Cape, marvelling at the seamanship required to navigate one of the most dangerous waters in the world. But once in the Pacific, the voyage took on a different character. The weather was calmer, the coastline more accessible, and the opportunities for exploration even greater. It was during this phase of the voyage that Charles began to formulate the questions that would guide his future research. He was accumulating vast amounts of data about geology, paleontology, and biogeography, but he lacked a theoretical framework to make sense of it all. The pieces of a great puzzle were spread before him, but he couldn't yet see how they fit together. The breakthrough would come in an unexpected place, during a brief stop at a group of volcanic islands that most sailors considered hardly worth visiting. Those islands were called the Galapagos, and they would change everything Charles thought he knew about the nature of life itself. The Galapagos Islands appeared on the horizon like a collection of black volcanic cones rising from the deep blue Pacific. Charles had read about these remote islands in the accounts of earlier explorers, but nothing had prepared him for their stark, otherworldly appearance. As HMS Beagle approached the archipelago on September 15th, 1835, the landscape seemed almost lunar in its desolation. Twisted lava flows created bizarre formations, and the islands appeared nearly devoid of vegetation from a distance. Captain Fitzroy was primarily interested in the islands for their strategic value as a watering station and their potential for accurate chronometer readings. The Galapagos lay directly on the equator, about 600 miles west of Ecuador, making them an ideal location for astronomical observations. For Charles, however, these volcanic islands would prove to be a living laboratory that would reshape his understanding of life itself. The first island they visited was Chatham, now known as San Cristobal. Charles was immediately struck by the peculiar nature of the wildlife. The animals showed no fear of humans, having evolved in isolation without natural predators. Giant tortoises, some weighing over 400 pounds, lumbered across the landscape like ancient living boulders. Marine iguanas, unlike anything found elsewhere on Earth, basked on black volcanic rocks before plunging into the surf to feed on underwater algae. But it was the birds that would provide the most crucial insights. Charles began collecting specimens of what he initially thought were blackbirds, wrens and finches. The variety seemed extraordinary for such small isolated islands. Some had massive beaks capable of cracking the hardest seeds, while others possessed delicate, needle-like bills perfect for extracting nectar from flowers. Still others had medium-sized beaks that appeared adapted for eating insects and small fruits. The mockingbirds proved equally puzzling. On each island Charles visited, he encountered mockingbirds that were clearly related but distinctly different from their neighbours. The birds on Charles Island had longer beaks and darker plumage than those on Chatham Island. Those on Albemarle Island differed again in subtle but consistent ways. Why should closely related birds vary so systematically from island to island? Charles spent only 5 weeks in the Galapagos, but those weeks would haunt his thinking for decades to come. He collected specimens methodically, though he didn't initially recognize the full significance of what he was observing. His notes from the time show a naturalist puzzled by the patterns he was seeing, but not yet grasping their revolutionary implications. The giant tortoises provided another piece of the puzzle. The vice-governor of the islands, an Englishman named Nicholas Lawson, casually mentioned to Charles that he could tell which island any tortoise came from just by looking at its shell. The tortoises from different islands had evolved distinct shell shapes and patterns. Those from dry islands had longer necks and saddle-shaped shells that allowed them to reach higher vegetation, while those from lush islands had dome-shaped shells and shorter necks. This observation struck Charles as deeply significant, though he couldn't immediately articulate why. If these tortoises had all descended from a common ancestor, what force could have caused them to diverge into distinct varieties on different islands? The question gnawed at him as the Beagle prepared to leave the Galapagos and continue westward across the Pacific. The voyage's next major stop was Tahiti, where Charles encountered a very different type of natural laboratory. The lush tropical island, with its towering volcanic peaks and coral-fringed lagoons, seemed like paradise compared to the harsh Galapagos. But here too, Charles made observations that would prove crucial to his developing understanding of natural processes. He was particularly fascinated by coral reefs, those massive structures built by tiny marine animals over vast periods of time. Charles spent hours wading in the crystal-clear lagoons, studying the different types of coral and the complex ecosystems they supported. He began to develop a theory about how coral atolls formed, a process that required the gradual subsidence of volcanic islands over geological timescales. The coral reef theory became Charles's first major scientific contribution, independent of his specimen collecting. He proposed that fringing reefs around volcanic islands gradually became barrier reefs as the islands slowly sank, eventually forming atolls when the original island disappeared entirely beneath the waves. The theory required vast amounts of time and gradual geological change, concepts that were becoming central to his worldview. From Tahiti, the Beagle sailed to New Zealand, where Charles encountered the Maori people and observed their complex relationship with the European colonists. The social tensions he witnessed forced him to think about human nature, cultural development, and the impact of civilization on indigenous peoples. These observations would later influence his views on human evolution and the common descent of all races. Australia proved to be another revelation. The continent's unique fauna, with its marsupials and monotremes, seemed to represent an entirely different approach to mammalian life. Charles marveled at kangaroos, wombats, and the bizarre duck-billed platypus. Why should Australia's mammals be so fundamentally different from those found elsewhere? The question of geographical distribution was becoming increasingly central to his thinking. In the Australian bush, Charles also encountered Aboriginal peoples and was struck by their sophisticated understanding of the natural environment. Despite European claims that they were primitive, the Aboriginal Australians demonstrated complex knowledge of plant and animal behaviour that far exceeded his own. This observation challenged common assumptions about human development and the supposed superiority of European civilization. The Beagle's journey around the Indian Ocean took Charles to the Keeling Islands, where he was able to test his coral reef theory through direct observation. The atolls there provided perfect examples of the process he had hypothesized, confirming his ideas about gradual geological change over enormous time periods. As the ship sailed across the Indian Ocean toward the Cape of Good Hope, Charles spent long hours organizing his notes and specimens. The sheer volume of material he had collected was staggering. He had gathered thousands of specimens representing hundreds of species, many of them new to science. His geological observations spanned an entire continent and provided evidence for processes operating over millions of years. But more importantly, patterns were beginning to emerge from the chaos of data. The geographical distribution of species followed rules that seemed to reflect their history rather than their current environments. Islands had fewer species than continents, but those species were often unique. Similar environments on different continents were populated by completely different groups of animals and plants. The fossil record told a story of change over time, with ancient forms showing relationships to modern species while differing in significant ways. The giant mammals of South America were clearly related to current inhabitants, but were adapted for different conditions. The progression from simple to complex forms in the geological record suggested development rather than static creation. Most puzzling of all were the variations Charles had observed within species, particularly in isolated populations, like those on the Galapagos Islands. The mockingbirds, the tortoises, even the finches showed systematic differences that correlated with their geographical separation. It was as if isolation itself was a creative force, somehow generating new varieties from common ancestors. As HMS Beagle rounded the Cape of Good Hope and began the final leg of its journey back to England, Charles found himself grappling with questions that challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of life. The evidence was pointing toward conclusions that seemed almost too radical to contemplate, yet the logic appeared inescapable. The young man who had left England as a conventional naturalist, planning to collect specimens that would demonstrate God's wisdom in creation, was returning as something very different. He had witnessed processes and patterns that suggested a very different explanation for the diversity and distribution of life on Earth. The transformation was gradual and subtle, but it was profound. Charles spent the last months of the voyage reading and rereading his notes, trying to make sense of the patterns he had observed. He began to sketch out tentative explanations for the geographical distribution of species, the relationship between fossils and living forms, and the variations he had seen within species on isolated islands. One book in particular captured his attention during these final months at sea. Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population argued that human populations naturally increase faster than food supplies, leading to competition and struggle for survival. The concept of struggle for existence resonated with Charles's observations of nature, where he had seen countless examples of competition between individuals and species. Could Malthus's principle apply to all living things? If so, what would be the consequences for variation within species? Charles began to see the outlines of a mechanism that could explain the patterns he had observed. If individuals varied in their ability to survive and reproduce, and if favourable variations could be inherited, then populations might gradually change over time. The idea was still fragmentary and speculative, but it offered a naturalistic explanation for phenomena that had previously required supernatural intervention. Charles was careful to keep these thoughts to himself, recognizing their potentially explosive implications for religion and society. On October 2nd, 1836, after 4 years and 9 months at sea, HMS Beagle finally anchored in Falmouth Harbour. Charles had circumnavigated the globe, travelled over 40,000 miles, and collected specimens from 4 continents. But more than that, he had undergone an intellectual transformation that would eventually revolutionize human understanding of life itself. The young gentleman naturalist who had boarded the Beagle with conventional views about creation and the fixity of species was returning as a secret revolutionary. He carried with him not just thousands of specimens, but the seeds of ideas that would grow into the theory of evolution by natural selection. As Charles stepped onto English soil for the first time in nearly 5 years, he had no way of knowing that the most difficult part of his journey was just beginning. Developing his revolutionary ideas into a coherent theory would take decades, and finding the courage to publish them would require even longer. The Beagle voyage had provided the raw materials for a scientific revolution, but the real work of construction lay ahead. The specimens he had collected would need to be studied by experts. The geological observations would require careful analysis, and the patterns he had glimpsed would need to be transformed into rigorous scientific theory. Most challenging of all, Charles would have to reconcile his growing understanding of natural processes with the religious and social expectations of Victorian England. But for now, Charles was simply grateful to be home. He was eager to see his family, to share his adventures, and to begin the long process of making sense of everything he had experienced. The shy young man who had left England, uncertain of his future, was returning as a seasoned naturalist with a reputation already established among London's scientific community. Henslow had been sharing Charles's letters and specimens with other naturalists throughout the voyage, and word of his discoveries had spread through scientific circles. Leading geologists were eager to examine his fossil discoveries. Ornithologists wanted to study his bird collections, and botanists were fascinated by his plant specimens from around the world. Charles found himself suddenly famous in scientific circles, though the general public remained unaware of his existence. The transformation from unknown young gentleman to respected naturalist had happened gradually during the voyage, but its full impact only became clear upon his return to England. The success was gratifying, but it also brought new responsibilities and challenges. Charles would need to write up his geological observations for publication, supervise the description of his zoological specimens, and somehow find time to pursue the theoretical questions that were increasingly consuming his thoughts. More immediately, he faced practical questions about his future career. The original plan for him to become a country clergyman now seemed impossible. How could he settle into the quiet routine of parish life when he had experienced the excitement of scientific discovery on a global scale? His father, initially skeptical about the voyage, was now proud of his son's achievements and willing to support whatever career path he chose. The Church of England was no longer a realistic option, but what alternatives existed for a gentleman naturalist in Victorian England? Science was not yet a profession in the modern sense. Universities had few research positions, and those were generally reserved for men with independent means. Charles would need to find a way to support himself while pursuing the theoretical work that increasingly fascinated him. Fortunately, his family's wealth provided a solution. His father was willing to provide a generous allowance that would allow Charles to live comfortably while devoting himself to scientific research. This financial independence would prove crucial to his future work, freeing him from the need to earn a living through teaching or other conventional employment. But money alone could not solve the deeper challenges Charles faced. He was increasingly convinced that species were not fixed and unchanging, but he had no clear mechanism to explain how they might change over time. The evidence from the Galapagos and elsewhere pointed toward transmutation, but the process remained mysterious. Moreover, any theory of species change would inevitably conflict with religious orthodoxy and social convention. The idea that humans might be related to other animals was not just scientifically controversial, but socially explosive. Charles understood that developing such ideas would require extraordinary care and discretion. As he settled back into English life, Charles began the long process of transforming his voyage experiences into scientific understanding. The journey had provided him with data and insights that would fuel decades of research, but it had also raised questions that would challenge the very foundations of Victorian thought about nature, humanity, and God. The real adventure, Charles was beginning to realise, was not the voyage itself but the intellectual journey that lay ahead. The Beagle had carried him around the physical world, but his mind was embarking on an even more ambitious expedition into uncharted territories of scientific thought. The notebooks Charles began filling upon his return to England would become some of the most important documents in the history of science. In July 1837, Just months after settling back into civilian life, he opened what he would later call his first notebook on the transmutation of species. The simple act of putting pen to paper represented a moment of profound courage. He was about to explore ideas that could destroy his reputation, alienate his friends, and challenge the very foundations of Victorian society. The notebook's pages reveal a mind wrestling with revolutionary concepts. Charles sketched evolutionary trees showing how different species might branch from common ancestors. He filled margins with questions that kept him awake at night. If species could change, what drove that change? How long did such transformations take? Most troubling of all, if animals could evolve from simpler forms, what did that mean for human beings? The evidence was mounting from every direction. As leading naturalists examined his Beagle specimens, startling patterns emerged. The birds he'd collected in the Galapagos were not the hodgepodge of different species he had initially assumed. John Gould, the renowned ornithologist, delivered shocking news. The various birds Charles had labelled as blackbirds, wrens and finches were actually all finches, closely related species that had somehow diverged from a common ancestor. The implications hit Charles like a thunderbolt. If these finches had indeed evolved from a single ancestral species that had somehow reached the isolated islands, then species were not fixed and immutable, as everyone believed. They could change, adapt, and give rise to new forms of life. The sacred boundary between one species and another was not sacred at all, but fluid and permeable. Richard Owen, the brilliant but arrogant anatomist who examined Charles's fossil mammals, provided even more unsettling evidence. The giant extinct creatures from South America were not random monsters, but clear relatives of living species. The massive ground sloths were related to modern sloths, the giant armadillos to their smaller descendants. There was an unmistakable pattern of succession, as if the past was connected to the present through an unbroken chain of descent. But the most disturbing revelation came from the mockingbirds. Charles had been more careful in labelling these specimens by island, and the results were unmistakable. Each island had its own distinct species of mockingbird, clearly related but definitively different. The pattern was too systematic to be coincidental. Somehow, isolation on different islands had transformed a single ancestral species into multiple distinct forms. Charles found himself caught between excitement and terror. The scientific implications were staggering, but so were the religious and social consequences. In Victorian England, the idea that species could change was not just scientifically controversial, but morally dangerous. It challenged the biblical account of creation, undermined human uniqueness, and suggested that nature operated according to natural laws, rather than divine intervention. The young naturalist began reading voraciously, searching for any theory that might explain what he had observed. He devoured the works of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, the French naturalist who had proposed that species could transform themselves through use and disuse of organs. A giraffe's neck might grow longer through generations of stretching to reach higher leaves. The theory was elegant but unsatisfying. It required organisms to somehow direct their own evolution, a process that seemed both unlikely and unobservable. Charles also studied his grandfather Erasmus Darwin's writings on evolution, discovering that the family intellectual tradition included speculation about species transformation. But these earlier theories lacked a convincing mechanism. They described what might happen, but not how or why it would occur. The breakthrough came in October 1838, 15 months after Charles had begun his secret notebooks. He was reading for amusement, as he later recalled, Thomas Malthus's essay on the principle of population. Malthus argued that human populations naturally increase geometrically, while food supplies increase only arithmetically, inevitably leading to competition, struggle, and death. The concept struck Charles with the force of revelation. If this principle applied to all living things, then nature must be engaged in a constant struggle for survival. Individuals with favourable variations would be more likely to survive and reproduce, while those with unfavourable traits would perish before passing them on. Over time, this process would gradually modify species in directions that enhanced survival. Charles had found his mechanism. Natural selection, as he would eventually call it, could explain everything he had observed during the Beagle voyage. The finches of the Galapagos had been shaped by different environmental pressures on different islands. Those with beaks best suited to available food sources survived and reproduced most successfully, gradually transforming the population. But even with a theoretical framework in place, Charles was not ready to share his ideas with the world. The implications were too radical, the evidence still incomplete, and the social risks too great. Instead, he began the methodical process of building an overwhelming case for his theory through careful observation and experimentation. He turned his attention to domestic animals and plants, studying how breeders created new varieties through artificial selection. If humans could transform pigeons, dogs, and roses through selective breeding, then perhaps nature could accomplish similar transformations through survival of the fittest. The analogy was not perfect, but it provided a model that people could understand. Charles also began corresponding with other naturalists, carefully probing their views on species and variation without revealing his own revolutionary conclusions. He discovered that many experts had private doubts about the fixity of species, though few were willing to express such thoughts publicly. The intellectual climate was more receptive to change than he had initially assumed, but it was still far from ready for a full-scale assault on religious orthodoxy. Meanwhile, his personal life was undergoing its own transformation. In 1838, the same year he discovered natural selection, Charles began seriously considering marriage. The decision was characteristically methodical. He drew up lists of pros and cons, weighing the advantages of companionship against the loss of scientific freedom. Marriage would mean domestic responsibilities, social obligations, and potential interference with his research. But it would also provide emotional support, intellectual companionship, and the stability he increasingly craved as his scientific work became more isolating and controversial. Charles was deeply aware that his evolutionary ideas would make him a target of criticism and perhaps ostracism. He would need allies and advocates who could provide both personal comfort and social protection. His choice fell upon his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, daughter of his uncle Josiah, who had helped convince his father to allow the Beagle voyage. Emma was intelligent, well-educated, and deeply religious. She was also patient, kind, and genuinely interested in Charles's scientific work, even when she didn't fully understand its implications. The courtship was gentle and affectionate rather than passionate. Charles and Emma had known each other since childhood, and their relationship grew naturally from friendship into love. They shared intellectual interests, family connections, and compatible temperaments. Both were serious-minded people who valued learning, family, and social responsibility. They married on January 29th, 1839, in a quiet ceremony at Emma's family church. The wedding was simple and elegant, attended by close family and friends, but without the elaborate social display that might have been expected for two members of such prominent families. Charles was 30 years old, Emma was 30, and both were ready to begin the next chapter of their lives together. The early years of marriage were among the happiest in Charles's life. Emma proved to be an ideal companion, intelligent enough to discuss his work, but tactful enough not to press him when he needed solitude. She managed their household with quiet efficiency, freeing him to focus on research while ensuring that their home was a place of comfort and intellectual stimulation. But there was one source of tension that would persist throughout their marriage. Emma's deep religious faith was genuine and unwavering, while Charles's beliefs were evolving in directions that increasingly conflicted with Christian orthodoxy. She worried about the implications of his scientific work, not just for his reputation, but for his soul. The thought that they might be separated in eternity by his loss of faith caused her genuine anguish. Charles was acutely aware of this tension and did everything possible to minimize it. He was careful not to discuss the more radical implications of his theory in Emma's presence, and he went through the motions of conventional religious observance even as his private beliefs diverged from Anglican doctrine. The deception was painful, but seemed necessary to preserve domestic harmony. Their first home was in London, where Charles could be close to scientific societies, museums, and fellow naturalists. He was elected to the Geological Society and began presenting papers on his Beagle observations. His work on coral reef formation gained international recognition, establishing him as a serious scientist rather than merely a specimen collector. But London life proved increasingly difficult for Charles's delicate constitution. The noise, smoke, and social pressures of the city aggravated health problems that had begun during the Beagle voyage. He suffered from chronic stomach ailments, headaches, and nervous exhaustion that made sustained intellectual work difficult. The birth of their first child, William, in December 1839, brought new joys and new anxieties. Charles was a devoted father who took genuine delight in observing his son's development. But parenthood also intensified his concerns about the implications of his evolutionary theory. If humans were indeed descended from animals, what did that mean for human dignity and moral responsibility? These questions became even more pressing as more children arrived. Anne was born in 1841, Mary in 1842. Charles found himself studying his children's development with the same scientific attention he devoted to barnacles and pigeons. Their expressions, their learning patterns, their emotional responses all seemed to reflect their animal heritage, while also demonstrating distinctly human qualities. The health problems that had begun in London continued to worsen, forcing Charles and Emma to consider leaving the city for a quieter environment. In 1842, they purchased Down House, a Georgian mansion in the Kent countryside, about 16 miles southeast of London. The move would prove transformative for both Charles's health and his scientific work. Down House became Charles's fortress of solitude, a place where he could pursue his research without the distractions and pressures of London society. The house sat on 18 acres of gardens, fields and woods that provided both privacy and opportunities for observation and experimentation. Charles immediately began transforming the grounds into a living laboratory, where he could study plant and animal behaviour under controlled conditions. The famous thinking path became a central feature of his daily routine. Charles would walk this circular route through the woods for hours, pondering scientific problems and working through theoretical difficulties. The path was marked with stones that he could kick aside to count his circuits, providing a measure of the intellectual intensity of each day's contemplation. The move to Down also marked a new phase in Charles's scientific work. He began focusing on detailed studies that would strengthen his evolutionary theory while avoiding direct confrontation with religious authorities. His 8-year investigation of barnacles, which began in 1846, exemplified this strategy. The work was tedious and exhausting, requiring microscopic examination of thousands of specimens from around the world. But the barnacle research served crucial purposes beyond its immediate scientific value. It established Charles as a leading expert in systematic biology, giving him credibility that would prove essential when he eventually published his evolutionary theory. More importantly, the detailed study of variation within and between barnacle species provided overwhelming evidence for the gradual transformation of life forms. The work also revealed the complexity of reproductive strategies in nature, challenging Victorian assumptions about natural moral order. Charles discovered barnacles that changed sex during their lifetimes, species where males were reduced to tiny parasites living inside females and reproductive arrangements that defied conventional categories. Nature, it seemed, was far stranger and more diverse than anyone had imagined. As the 1840s turned into the 1850s, Charles continued building his case for evolution while maintaining public silence about his most radical conclusions. He conducted breeding experiments with pigeons, studied the geographical distribution of plants and animals, and corresponded with naturalists around the world. Every investigation strengthened his conviction that species were not fixed but capable of indefinite modification. The pressure to publish was growing, both from within and without. Charles had confided his theory to a few trusted friends, including the botanist Joseph Hooker and the geologist Charles Lyell, both of whom urged him to make his ideas public before someone else discovered the same principles. The scientific community was increasingly receptive to evolutionary ideas, and several naturalists were working along similar lines. But Charles remained cautious, aware that premature publication could destroy his reputation and undermine the eventual acceptance of his theory. He needed not just evidence, but overwhelming evidence. Not just a theory, but a theory so thoroughly supported that it could withstand the inevitable attacks from religious and scientific conservatives. The tension between his public reputation as a respectable gentleman naturalist and his private role as a revolutionary theorist was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Charles was living a double life, presenting conventional scientific papers while secretly developing ideas that would transform humanity's understanding of itself. The resolution of this tension would come sooner than he expected, triggered by events beyond his control that would force him to choose between continued secrecy and scientific immortality. The careful strategy he had pursued for nearly 2 decades was about to be overtaken by circumstances that would demand immediate action. Action. The careful world Charles had constructed at Down House was about to be shattered by a single letter that arrived on June 18th, 1858. The morning had begun like countless others. Charles was in his study, surrounded by the comfortable chaos of scientific papers, specimen bottles, and half-finished manuscripts. He was working methodically through his correspondence when he noticed an envelope bearing the postmark of the Dutch East Indies. The sender was Alfred Russel Wallace, a young naturalist who had been collecting specimens in Southeast Asia. Charles knew Wallace by reputation as a dedicated field worker, someone following a path similar to his own Beagle voyage decades earlier. Wallace's letters had always been respectful, seeking advice from the older, more established scientist. But this letter was different. Inside the envelope was a manuscript titled On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. As Charles read the first few paragraphs, his blood turned cold. Wallace had independently discovered the principle of natural selection. The younger man had arrived at virtually identical conclusions through his own observations of species distribution in the Malay archipelago. The irony was breathtaking. While Charles had spent 20 years carefully building his case, afraid to publish his revolutionary ideas, Wallace had reached the same insights and was ready to share them with the world immediately. The manuscript was accompanied by a letter asking Charles to evaluate the paper and, if he thought it worthwhile, to forward it to Charles Lyell for possible publication. Charles sat frozen at his desk, the manuscript trembling in his hands. 20 years of meticulous research, of careful theory building, of agonizing over evidence and implications. And now, someone else was about to claim credit for the greatest scientific discovery of the age. The young man's paper was clear, concise, and devastatingly correct. Wallace had even used some of the same examples and arguments that Charles had developed in his own unpublished work. The ethical dilemma was excruciating. Charles could simply forward Wallace's paper to Lyell as requested, ensuring that the younger man received full credit for the discovery. This would be the honourable course, the action of a gentleman scientist who put truth above personal ambition. but it would also mean that 2 decades of Charles's life work would be reduced to a footnote in scientific history. Alternatively, Charles could rush his own work into print, using his superior reputation and connections to overshadow Wallace's contribution. But this would be a betrayal of scientific ethics and personal honour that Charles could never live with. The young man had trusted him with the manuscript, seeking his guidance and support, not competition. Charles paced his thinking path frantically, his mind racing through options and consequences. The stones that usually marked his contemplative circuits lay forgotten as he struggled with the greatest crisis of his scientific career. Emma watched from the house with growing concern as her husband walked faster and faster, his distress visible even at a distance. The solution came through the intervention of Charles's closest scientific allies. Lyell and Hooker, both of whom had been urging Charles to publish for years, proposed a compromise that would preserve both men's claims to the discovery. They arranged for a joint presentation to the Linnean Society of London, where Wallace's paper would be read alongside extracts from Charles's earlier writings that proved his priority in developing the theory. The presentation took place on July 1st, 1858, in the absence of both principal figures. Wallace was still collecting in the distant East Indies, unaware that his manuscript was being shared with London's scientific elite. Charles was at Down House, devastated by the recent death of his youngest son, Charles Waring, from scarlet fever. The personal tragedy had overwhelmed his scientific concerns, reducing the priority dispute to insignificance beside the reality of loss. The joint presentation received a surprisingly muted response from the Linnean Society audience. Many members seemed puzzled by the theoretical nature of the papers, preferring the concrete descriptions of new species that usually dominated their meetings. The president of the society later remarked that the year had not been marked by any revolutionary discoveries, a comment that would become one of science's greatest ironies. But the presentation served its crucial purpose of establishing both men's contributions to the theory while spurring Charles to immediate action. He could no longer delay publication indefinitely, hoping to perfect his arguments and anticipate every objection. The scientific community was now aware that a theory of evolution by natural selection existed, and they would expect a full exposition of the evidence and reasoning behind it. Charles threw himself into writing with an intensity that surprised even Emma. The massive book he had been planning for decades was abandoned in favour of what he called an abstract of his theory. Even this abbreviated version would require enormous effort to complete quickly enough to establish his full priority while doing justice to the complexity of his ideas. The writing process was tortuous. Charles had to condense 20 years of research into a single volume while maintaining scientific rigour and anticipating the fierce opposition his theory would inevitably provoke. Every sentence needed to be crafted carefully, every example chosen to maximum effect, every argument structured to withstand the most hostile scrutiny. His health, always fragile, deteriorated under the pressure. The stomach ailments and nervous exhaustion that had plagued him for years intensified as he pushed himself to work longer hours than his constitution could bear. Emma watched helplessly as her husband drove himself toward what seemed like a complete breakdown in his desperate race to complete the book. The children at Down House learned to tiptoe around their father's study, understanding instinctively that something momentous was happening behind the closed door. Charles barely emerged for meals, eating mechanically while his mind continued wrestling with theoretical problems. The careful routine that had structured his life for years was abandoned in favour of frantic productivity. Friends and colleagues offered assistance, but Charles found it impossible to delegate the crucial work of writing. Every word had to be his own, every argument carefully considered and reconsidered. He was acutely aware that this book would define his scientific legacy and potentially transform human understanding of life itself. The manuscript grew steadily through the autumn and winter of 1858. Charles wrote and rewrote chapters, constantly refining his arguments and searching for clearer ways to express complex ideas. The evidence from his Beagle voyage was woven together with observations from his breeding experiments, correspondence with fellow naturalists, and detailed studies of domestic animals and plants. The theoretical framework was elegant in its simplicity. All living things produce more offspring than can possibly survive. These offspring vary in countless small ways. Those individuals with variations that enhance survival and reproduction will leave more descendants. Over time, favourable variations will accumulate while unfavourable ones disappear, gradually transforming species and giving rise to new forms of life. But Charles knew that simplicity of concept did not guarantee acceptance of conclusion. The implications of his theory were staggering. If all species descended from common ancestors through natural processes, then humans were not special creations but modified animals. The comfortable boundaries between human and beast, between sacred and secular, between design and chance would all collapse. Religious objections were inevitable and predictable. The theory directly contradicted the biblical account of creation and undermined the argument from design that had dominated natural theology for generations. If complex organs like the eye could evolve gradually through natural selection, then there was no need to invoke divine intervention to explain biological complexity. Scientific objections would be equally serious. Many naturalists still believed in the fixity of species, despite growing evidence for change over time. The fossil record seemed incomplete, lacking the countless intermediate forms that gradual evolution should produce. The mechanism of inheritance was poorly understood, raising questions about how favourable variations could be preserved and transmitted to offspring. Social objections might prove most dangerous of all. Victorian society was built on assumptions of hierarchy, progress, and divine purpose that evolution seemed to challenge. If humans were merely animals subject to the same natural laws as beetles and barnacles, what happened to moral responsibility, social order, and religious authority? Charles addressed these objections systematically, building his case through careful accumulation of evidence and reasoning. He acknowledged difficulties honestly, while demonstrating that his theory explained more phenomena more simply than any alternative. The book became both a scientific treatise and a work of persuasion, designed to win converts rather than merely present facts. The title he chose reflected his strategy perfectly. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life, emphasised the mechanism of change rather than its implications for human nature. Charles deliberately avoided discussing human evolution in detail, saving that explosive topic for future consideration. By the summer of 1859, the manuscript was nearing completion. Charles sent early chapters to trusted friends for comment, incorporating their suggestions while maintaining his overall argument. The feedback was generally encouraging, though several correspondents warned him to expect fierce opposition from religious authorities and conservative scientists. John Murray, the distinguished London publisher, agreed to publish the book based on a brief outline and Lyell's strong recommendation. Murray was known for his scientific publications and had the resources to promote controversial works effectively. The partnership would prove crucial to the book's eventual success. As publication approached, Charles's anxiety reached almost unbearable levels. He knew that his life would never be the same once the book appeared. The comfortable anonymity he had enjoyed for decades would be shattered, replaced by controversy, criticism, and possibly social ostracism. Emma shared his fears, worrying about the impact on their family and their standing in the community. The final months of preparation were consumed with proofreading, indexing, and last-minute revisions. Charles obsessed over every detail, aware that hostile critics would seize upon any error or unclear passage. The book needed to be not just correct, but unassailable, presenting such overwhelming evidence that reasonable people would be compelled to accept its conclusions. On November 24th, 1859, On the Origin of Species was published in London. The first edition of 1,250 copies sold out on the day of publication, indicating intense interest in the scientific community and among educated readers generally. Murray immediately ordered a second printing, recognizing that he had a phenomenon on his hands. Charles had fled to a health spa in Yorkshire, unable to bear the stress of watching his book's reception. From his retreat, he anxiously awaited news of reviews and reactions. The 20-year secret was finally out, and the world would never be quite the same. The reviews began appearing within weeks, ranging from enthusiastic support to furious condemnation. Progressive scientists hailed the book as a masterpiece of reasoning and observation. Conservative critics attacked it as dangerous materialism that reduced humans to the level of beasts. Religious authorities denounced it as atheistic propaganda designed to undermine Christian faith and social order. But the debate had begun, and there could be no turning back. Charles Darwin, the quiet country gentleman who had spent decades studying barnacles and breeding pigeons, had launched a revolution that would transform not just science, but humanity's understanding of its place in the natural world. The boy who had collected beetles in Shropshire had grown into the man who would forever change how we see ourselves. The voyage that had begun on HMS Beagle was reaching its ultimate destination, not in any geographical location, but in the realm of ideas where the most important discoveries are made. The world was about to discover what Charles Darwin had learned during 5 years at sea and 20 years of careful thought, that life on Earth was far stranger, more wonderful, and more interconnected than anyone had ever imagined. The revolution was just beginning, and its consequences would echo through every corner of human knowledge and belief. The storm Charles had unleashed broke with unexpected ferocity across Victorian England. Within days of publication, On the Origin of Species had ignited debates in drawing rooms, university halls, and church pulpits throughout the nation. The quiet naturalist who had spent decades avoiding controversy now found himself at the centre of the most explosive intellectual battle of his generation. The initial reviews revealed the profound fault lines running through British society. The scientific establishment split dramatically. Thomas Huxley, the brilliant young biologist who would become known as Darwin's bulldog, immediately recognised the revolutionary importance of the theory. He famously declared that upon reading the book, his reaction was, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of that." Huxley threw himself into defending natural selection with a combative enthusiasm that Charles himself could never muster. But opposition was equally fierce and well organised. Richard Owen, the renowned anatomist who had described many of Charles's Beagle fossils, emerged as one of the theory's most formidable critics. Owen's attacks were particularly painful because they came from someone Charles had considered a friend and ally. The personal betrayal stung almost as much as the scientific criticism, revealing how evolutionary theory was fracturing long-standing relationships throughout the scholarly community. The religious response was swift and predictable. Bishop Samuel Wilberforce, known as Soapy Sam for his eloquent but slippery rhetorical style, appointed himself the defender of biblical orthodoxy against Darwinian materialism. Wilberforce possessed both the theological authority and public platform necessary to mobilize religious opposition to the new theory. His sermons against evolution drew enormous crowds eager to hear scientific materialism refuted from the pulpit. The confrontation everyone anticipated came at the Oxford University Museum on June 30th, 1860, during a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. The event was ostensibly a discussion of scientific papers, but everyone understood it would become a trial of evolutionary theory before the court of educated public opinion. Charles himself was absent, as usual, avoiding direct confrontation, but his supporters and critics gathered for what promised to be an intellectual gladiatorial contest. The debate that followed became legendary, though accounts differ dramatically depending on the political and religious sympathies of the witnesses. Wilberforce rose to deliver what he clearly intended as a devastating critique of Darwin's theory, combining scientific objections with moral outrage at the implications of human descent from animals. His speech was eloquent, learned, and calculated to appeal to the religious sensibilities of his audience. But Wilberforce made a crucial tactical error in the heat of rhetorical battle. Turning to Huxley with condescending sarcasm, he asked whether the biologist claimed descent from an ape, through his grandfather's or grandmother's side. The question was intended as a killing blow, reducing evolutionary theory to an absurdity that would provoke laughter and disgust from the assembled worthies. Instead, it provided Huxley with the opening he needed to deliver one of the most famous riposts in the history of science. Rising slowly to his feet, Huxley declared that he would rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his considerable talents to ridicule scientific truth. The response electrified the audience, clearly establishing that evolutionary theory had articulate and fearless defenders who would not be intimidated by religious authority. The Oxford debate marked a turning point in public perception of the evolution controversy. What had begun as a scientific discussion was clearly becoming a broader cultural war between traditional religious authority and emerging scientific materialism. The stakes were nothing less than the intellectual foundations of Victorian civilization. Charles followed these developments from his refuge at Down House with a mixture of gratification and horror. He was pleased that his theory was receiving serious consideration from leading scientists, but he was appalled by the personal attacks and bitter rhetoric that characterized much of the debate. The gentle naturalist had hoped for reasoned discussion based on evidence and logic, not the ideological warfare that was actually erupting. The stress of the controversy exacerbated his chronic health problems. Charles's mysterious illness, which had plagued him since the Beagle voyage, intensified under the pressure of public scrutiny. He suffered from severe digestive problems, heart palpitations, and nervous exhaustion that left him barely able to function for days at a time. Emma watched helplessly as the debate over his life's work seemed to be destroying his physical and mental health, but support was building steadily within the scientific community. Asa Gray, the distinguished Harvard botanist, became evolution's leading advocate in America, skillfully arguing that natural selection was compatible with religious belief. Gray's theistic interpretation of Darwin's theory helped neutralize some religious opposition by suggesting that God might work through natural processes rather than direct intervention. Charles Lyell, whose geological theories had provided the foundation for evolutionary thinking, initially hesitated to embrace the full implications of natural selection. As an older man with established religious beliefs, Lyell found it difficult to accept that humans had descended from animal ancestors. But gradually, the weight of evidence convinced him that his young friend's theory was essentially correct, whatever its disturbing implications for human dignity. International recognition came quickly, as translations appeared in German, French, and other major languages. European scientists, many of whom had been developing similar ideas independently, generally received evolutionary theory more favourably than their British counterparts. The German scientific community, in particular, embraced Darwin's work with enthusiasm, recognising its profound implications for biology, psychology, and philosophy. The American reception was complicated by the Civil War, which began just as Origin of Species was gaining attention across the Atlantic. The question of human unity and diversity, central to evolutionary theory, became entangled with debates over slavery and racial equality. Some abolitionists seized upon evolution to argue for the fundamental kinship of all human races, while defenders of slavery attempted to use evolutionary ideas to justify racial hierarchy and oppression. Charles watched these political applications of his scientific work with growing dismay. He had deliberately avoided discussing human evolution in Origin of Species, hoping to establish the general principle of natural selection before tackling its most controversial implications. But the logic of his theory inevitably led to questions about human origins, racial differences, and social organization that he was not yet prepared to address publicly. The success of his book created new pressures and opportunities. Publishers clamored for expanded editions, foreign translations, and popular adaptations. Scientific societies invited him to lecture, though he consistently declined public speaking engagements due to his health and temperament. The shy naturalist who had once collected beetles in obscurity now found himself one of the most famous and controversial figures in the English-speaking world. More importantly, the positive reception of evolutionary theory encouraged Charles to pursue lines of research he had previously considered too dangerous. If educated opinion was beginning to accept the transformation of species, perhaps the time was approaching when he could address the ultimate question: the origin and nature of human beings themselves. The evidence for human evolution was overwhelming once one accepted the general principle of natural selection. The anatomical similarities between humans and other primates had long been recognized by comparative anatomists. The embryological evidence was equally compelling, showing that human development recapitulated stages found in other mammals. The geographical distribution of human races followed patterns consistent with gradual divergence from common ancestors. But addressing human evolution directly would require extraordinary courage and careful preparation. Charles understood that extending his theory to include human origins would provoke even fiercer opposition than he had already encountered. Religious authorities would be outraged by explicit challenges to the biblical account of Adam and Eve. Social conservatives would be horrified by implications for human uniqueness and moral responsibility. Throughout the early 1860s, Charles continued his methodical approach to controversial topics. He published detailed studies of orchid fertilization and climbing plants that demonstrated the power of natural selection to explain complex adaptations. These works served multiple purposes. They provided additional evidence for evolutionary theory while establishing Charles as a master of observational biology. The Orchid book, in particular, became a masterpiece of scientific detection. Charles demonstrated that the elaborate structures of orchid flowers were perfectly adapted to ensure cross-fertilization by specific insect pollinators. The complexity of these relationships rivaled anything in engineering, yet they could be explained entirely through natural selection without invoking divine design. The work on climbing plants revealed another dimension of natural selection's creative power. Charles showed how simple movements toward light or support had evolved into sophisticated mechanisms for seeking and grasping external structures. Tendrils could distinguish between living and dead supports, coiling around suitable objects while rejecting inappropriate ones. The behavior seemed almost intelligent, yet it emerged from purely mechanical processes shaped by survival advantage. These detailed studies served as intellectual preparation for the greater challenge ahead. If natural selection could explain orchid complexity and plant behavior, it could certainly account for the development of human intelligence, emotion, and moral sense. The question was not whether evolutionary theory applied to humans, but whether Charles had the courage to say so publicly. The decision to write directly about human evolution crystallized gradually through the mid-1860s. Charles began collecting notes on human behavior, expression, and psychology with the same systematic approach he had applied to barnacles and pigeons. He studied his own children's development, corresponded with missionaries and travelers about primitive societies, and read everything available on psychology and anthropology. The project would eventually become 2 books, The Descent of Man and The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. Together, they would complete the revolution begun by Origin of Species by demonstrating that humans were not separate from nature, but fully part of the evolutionary process that had shaped all life on Earth. But first, Charles needed to address another dimension of evolutionary theory that had been largely neglected in his original work. Natural selection explained how useful traits spread through populations, but it seemed inadequate to account for many features of the living world. Why did peacocks have such elaborate tails that seemed to hinder survival? Why did many animals engage in complex courtship rituals that served no obvious adaptive function? The answer lay in what Charles would call sexual selection, a process distinct from but related to natural selection. In species where individuals competed for mates, traits that enhanced reproductive success could evolve even if they reduced survival. The peacock's tail was not useful for finding food or escaping predators, but it was enormously effective at attracting females and intimidating rival males. Sexual selection would prove crucial for understanding human evolution. Many distinctly human traits, from artistic ability to complex language, might have evolved not because they enhanced survival, but because they made individuals more attractive as mates. The theory suggested that human culture itself might be an elaborate form of sexual display, comparable to birdsong or butterfly wings. These ideas were developing in Charles's private notebooks throughout the 1860s, but he remained reluctant to publish them. The reception of Origin of Species had been exhausting, and he was not eager to provoke another round of controversy. Moreover, his health continued to deteriorate under the stress of his scientific work and public notoriety. The death of his beloved daughter Annie in 1851 had already shattered Charles's remaining religious faith, leaving him increasingly isolated from the comfort that sustained most Victorians facing mortality and suffering. The evolutionary perspective on life and death was clear-eyed but cold, offering scientific understanding in place of spiritual consolation. Charles found himself caught between the harsh truths revealed by natural selection and the human need for meaning and hope. Emma's continuing religious devotion created additional tension within the Darwin household. She understood and supported her husband's scientific work, but she worried constantly about its implications for his soul and their eternal reunion. The theological questions raised by evolutionary theory were not abstract intellectual puzzles, but deeply personal concerns that affected the most intimate relationships in Charles's life. Despite these pressures, the scientific work continued with characteristic methodical precision. Charles's correspondence network expanded to include researchers throughout Europe and America, creating an international community of evolutionary biologists. Young scientists made pilgrimages to Down House seeking guidance from the master, returning to their own institutions as evangelists for the new biology. The transformation of natural science was accelerating beyond anything Charles had anticipated when he first opened his secret notebooks on species change. Universities were establishing new programs in biology. Museums were reorganizing their collections according to evolutionary principles, and textbooks were being rewritten to incorporate natural selection. The revolution was becoming institutionalized, ensuring its permanence regardless of continuing religious and social opposition. But the most profound changes were yet to come. The application of evolutionary thinking to human psychology, society, and culture would prove even more transformative than its biological implications. Charles was preparing to extend his theory into territories that would challenge every aspect of Victorian assumptions about human nature and social organisation. the quiet naturalist who had spent his career studying barnacles and pigeons, was about to tackle the greatest mystery of all, the evolutionary origins of the human mind itself. The journey that had begun with seasickness aboard HMS Beagle was approaching its ultimate destination in the most complex and controversial questions science had ever attempted to answer. By 1871, Charles had finally summoned the courage to address the question that had haunted him for decades. The descent of man and selection in relation to sex represented the culmination of 30 years of careful thought about humanity's place in nature. The book that emerged was both a logical extension of evolutionary theory and a revolutionary challenge to everything Victorian society believed about human uniqueness. The evidence Charles presented was overwhelming and methodical. He demonstrated the anatomical similarities between humans and other primates, showing that every bone, muscle, and organ had clear counterparts in our closest relatives. The embryological evidence was equally compelling, revealing that human development followed patterns identical to other mammals. Even more provocatively, Charles argued that human mental faculties had evolved gradually from simpler animal minds. Intelligence, emotion, morality, even the capacity for religious feeling could all be traced through the animal kingdom in rudimentary forms. Bees demonstrated mathematical precision in constructing their hives. Birds showed aesthetic preferences in choosing mates. Elephants displayed grief for their dead. The supposedly unbridgeable gap between human and animal psychology was revealed to be an illusion created by our own pride and ignorance. Sexual selection emerged as a crucial mechanism in human evolution. Charles argued that many distinctly human traits, from our reduced body hair to our capacity for music and art, had evolved not for survival, but for attracting mates. Human culture itself might represent an elaborate form of sexual display, comparable to the peacock's tail or the bowerbird's decorated nest. The implications were staggering. If humans had evolved through natural processes, then traditional notions of special creation, divine purpose, and inherent superiority crumbled. We were not fallen angels, but risen apes, shaped by the same forces that had moulded every other species on Earth. The revelation was both humbling and liberating, stripping away comfortable illusions while revealing our deep kinship with all life. The book's reception was predictably explosive. Religious leaders denounced it as the final assault on Christian civilization. Conservative scientists criticized its speculative elements and lack of direct evidence for human evolution. Social reformers seized upon its implications for racial equality and women's rights. The debate raged in newspapers, lecture halls, and private salons throughout Britain and America. But Charles had accomplished something remarkable. He had extended evolutionary thinking into the most sensitive areas of human experience, while maintaining scientific rigor and avoiding unnecessary provocation. The evidence he presented was so comprehensive, and the arguments so carefully constructed, that even hostile critics found it difficult to dismiss entirely. So there you have it, the complete life of Charles Darwin, from a seasick young gentleman aboard a creaking ship to the architect of the most profound revolution in human thought. The boy who collected beetles in the English countryside became the man who showed us our place in the tree of life itself. Darwin's story reminds us that the greatest discoveries often come from the most unlikely circumstances. A voyage that almost never happened, a theory that took decades to reveal, a quiet naturalist who changed everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our world.